All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second week of CRISPRCon 2020 and the second session of our second week focused on race and health equity. As those of you who've been around know, I'm Mallory Huggins of the Keystone Policy Center. Keystone is a third-party, nonprofit, non-advocacy organization that has spent the last 45 years helping to bring diverse perspectives to bear on decision-making in food and agriculture, natural resources, health, education, energy, and more. We strive to help leaders see and solve problems beyond their own perspectives. Keystone Policy Center is based in Keystone, Colorado, which is the traditional homeland of the Ute people, although I personally am based out of our Washington, D.C. office on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank people, from whom the Anacostia River takes its name. We at Keystone are proud to help facilitate CRISPRCon's conversations on science, society, and the future of gene editing. The mission of CRISPRCon is to create a unique forum of diverse voices across a variety of applications in health, agriculture, conservation, and more, although this week's sessions will focus primarily on gene editing and health. CRISPRCon is all about conversation, not consensus. So we aim to highlight many perspectives and experiences, spark curiosity, build understanding, and share societal histories and other contexts that is relevant to decisions on gene editing technologies. 2020 is CRISPRCon's fourth year. And in this virtual format, we have 10 webinars and 5 themes over 2 months, plus additional discussion through our participant-led after the panel discussion. Throughout this entire series, we have a broad-ranging lineup of speakers and topics, and while we know we can't hear from everyone, we do hope that our lineup helps to demonstrate the diversity of voices and issues that are and should be part of the conversation on gene editing. So this week's theme has been race and health equity, which aims to address the relationship between race, or more accurately, racism and health. On Tuesday, our panelists talked about the relationship among race, gene editing, and COVID-19, thinking through things like, from where do health disparities arise? How are we seeing them play out with COVID-19? Where can gene editing help correct or exacerbate those inequities? And how does all of that relate to structural changes? In that session, we started to get into some of the themes for today's session, bringing up ideas around access, education, community engagement, trust. And today we'll dig in even more, considering how we might more responsibly innovate with the meaningful inclusion and amplification of Black voices in science, technology, and healthcare. I want to thank our partners in this session and this week: Howard University's Dr. Latifah Jackson, Jennifer Caldwell, and Carter Clinton, all with Howard's W. Montauk Cobb Research Laboratory. We're lucky enough to hear from Jen today as part of the panel, in fact. And we are also so grateful to our longtime advisor, Michael Friend of the Minority Coalition for Precision Medicine. We want to thank all of our sponsors for supporting the mission of CRISPRCon and our ability to create these important conversations. Sponsors for this session are Corteva and the United Soybean Board. You can learn more about our week's partners and sponsors and access past CRISPRCon content in our expo. And some of you may have already seen it, but I do want to point out a video created especially for this week by Vic Mahays, a graduate student in Howard's Department of Biology, who created a very short flash talk about how CRISPR is involved in his research on the impacts of COVID-19 on African Americans. Those videos, including Vic's, will remain housed in the expo section of Hopin, as well as stay on CRISPRCon's YouTube page after today. So we hope that the dialogue will bring out lots of lively discussion and debate among panelists and participants, and I'll bring them on very shortly here. If you're joining us via Hopin, please make sure to use the stage chat to submit questions for the panelists at any time during the conversation. Anyone watching on YouTube will be able to watch the whole session live, but you won't be able to submit questions. We welcome divergence and disagreement, but please also be empathetic, curious, engaged, and respectful as you listen and share across various perspectives. We also encourage you to share your thoughts on social media with the hashtag CRISPRCon 2020. Those of you who joined us on Tuesday may have noticed that the panelists didn't begin directly talking about gene editing until 30 or 40 minutes into the conversation. And that's because we think context is essential in these conversations on gene editing, and in particular on equity. Community engagement, the subject of today's session, and social license are built on relationships and trust. And as you'll hear from the panelists, any gene editing application that research is built on data that comes from samples that are selected by researchers who make choices about who and what those samples include. Our panelists will talk about that, and they'll also bring forward that any conversation that wishes to talk about race and gene editing in the US and globally in 2020 must acknowledge the impact of the transatlantic slave trade. These contexts matter. One additional bit of context I'll mention before turning it over to our panelists is that we are hosting these events in September in part because it's Sickle Cell Awareness Month. And the potential for CRISPR to treat or cure sickle cell disease and what that means for health equity has been an important theme across all of our CRISPRCon events. And you'll hear our panelists speak to that today. So without further ado, I will stop talking and I will turn it over to those panelists and start to bring them on stage. So first up, I'll introduce our moderator, Dr. Janina Jeff. So Janina, you can go ahead and share your audio and video. Dr. Janina Jeff is the senior bioinformatics scientist at Illumina and host of In Those Genes podcast. At Illumina, she works on the genotyping array portfolio and has formal training in analyzing large omic data sets, applying computational genomics methods, bioinformatics, and statistical programming to understand population substructure and disease associations. Today, though, Janina is wearing more of the hat of her podcast work and her work as an educator and a STEAM activist. So her podcast, In Those Genes, is a science and culture podcast that uses genetics to decode the lost history of African-descended Americans. So hello, Janina, and welcome.
Hi.
Next, I'll bring on Jen Caldwell. Jen Caldwell is a doctoral student and graduate researcher in the W. Montague Cobb Research Lab. Jennifer's research includes genetic and environmental interactions that influence cardiovascular disease and stroke in African American populations. The Gullahs of the coastal sea island are a prototype microethnic group of African Americans, and they have a rich African heritage. And Jennifer has specific interest in population genetics and epigenetic methods used for gene discovery and application, or an expansion rather, of precision medicine research. You'll hear more about all of that, including work with the Gullahs from Jen today. So Jen, you can go ahead and share your audio and video as well. I will next introduce Akua Page. Akua is a Geechee language and cultural activist, content creator, educator, and she has created the Instagram account, The Geechee Experience, which has over 18,000 followers. It talks about Geechee language and culture, and Akua is part of the community that Jen has been working with on her research. Akua, I'll ask you to also share your audio and video now. Next up is Dr. Latifah Jackson, who is an adjunct assistant professor at Howard University. She's a bioinformatician with a demonstrated history of working in academic, healthcare, and nonprofit settings. Her work brings in biomedical science, epidemiology, human genetics, and large-scale data analysis. So Dr. Jackson, you can share your audio and video now too. And finally, we have Dr. Eric Chery, assistant professor of social work and adjunct professor of Africana Studies at Indiana University in Indianapolis. Eric, you won't be able to show your audio and video until I roll off the screen, so we'll do that in just 1 second. But Eric's overall research focuses on working with communities to theorize racism, to examine and identify underlying mechanisms by which racism restricts and denies people of African descents access to psychosocial, educational, and societal opportunities from an evolutionary standpoint. And he works to empower them to interrupt racism and advance social justice in communities through education. So we have a lot of great topics to get into with these panelists. And so I will remove myself from the screen, and without further ado, turn it over to you, Janina, for our conversation on responsible innovation, gene editing, and race.
Thank you so much, Mallory. Before I go into a long spill of talking, can I get a thumbs up from my fellow panelists that you can hear me? Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I don't want to go down in 5 minutes into talking. You guys like, we can't hear you. So I'm super excited to really, host and drive this conversation. It's a much needed conversation. A lot of times, one of the things that I like to think about is we're always talking about the advancement of medicine. And when we start to bring in race, we start to bring up this concept called personalized medicine. And personalized medicine is just this idea that we start to take medicine as we know it, from diagnoses to preventative medicine and to actual treatments, and we personalize it for populations or for individuals. So it's this very futuristic idea of how we begin to use medicine in ways that are more personable. And right now, I think we're getting to a stage where we're not quite at the individual level, but we're getting closer to a population level. And by population here, I'm defining this as a genetically unique population. And so one of the things is, as we start to advance technology and as we start to I think we do have some feedback too. I do hear it. I'm not sure who it's coming from. Yeah, and as we start to advance technology and as we start to advance medicine, it's really important that we keep this inclusive. And when I say inclusive, that means that we are, it's actually quite loud. I hear a plane or something, so. Anyway, as we start to think about inclusivity, what exactly does that mean? And so inclusivity does not necessarily mean, doesn't necessarily mean that we are taking everyone who is representative of the world and bringing them in. Inclusivity really means that we are, letting all the groups of the populations have a seat at the table and make decisions, because these decisions are a part of how we include and how we really start to advance technology going forward. A lot of the time we have seen technology advances in the absence of inclusivity and diversity. And we have a long-standing history of research being done on us, and us here being non-European populations, people of color, without us. And so some of these landmark examples are the use of DNA to create drugs, and these drugs being used to eradicate diseases, but then access to these drugs not being able or not accessible to the populations that were actually used to develop the drugs. And so a really good example of that is in pharmacogenomics, with the lipid-lowering medication. But also we've seen inequity in research and research studies. And so a really nice example of a hallmark comparison of two avenues or two parts of research, two diseases, I should say, that are being conducted that are inequitable is cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease. And so cystic fibrosis affects 30,000 people in the US, and sickle cell disease affects 100,000 people. That's 70,000 more people in the US alone compared to cystic fibrosis. However, when we look at the research that's being funded for cystic fibrosis, there's 27 times more funding for cystic fibrosis. Remember, there's 70,000 less cases compared to something like sickle cell disease, which not only is affecting 70,000 more people, but typically patients who have sickle cell disease spend much more time in the hospital and are actually sicker. And so why do we see this inequity in research funds from cystic fibrosis to sickle cell disease. I will tell you the only distinguishing factor between these two is that sickle cell disease primarily affects children of African descent compared to cystic fibrosis, which primarily affects those of European descent. And so without, pointing fingers or making assumption, the only difference here is the ancestral background of the patient population. But as we are advancing and we are learning things like gene editing and CRISPR, we know that we can use these technologies, these modern technologies that have only been present in the last 10 years or so, to better understand and in some case eradicate some of these diseases. And so we start to ask these questions of who should have access to this technology. When we look at the sickle cell and cystic fibrosis example, we know 70,000 more patients are affected by sickle cell disease. How are we providing access to this technology in an equitable fashion? I just kind of want to start there with how we really start to cultivate this conversation of technology access and how it is being used. And so I'll stop here and I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves before we get into this very, very, very important discussion.
I'll go first. My name is Jim Caldwell, as Mallory said, and we've been working on putting together this panel for a very long time. And the what we want to focus on for this panel is first the context of African Americans in America and why we are marginalized in healthcare and medical research and scientific experiments, maybe the history of scientific experiments, and there's definitely some feedback. And just why we have been marginalized over time, where that started, the structural racism that occurred in building this country, and also where we are today, looking at COVID-19. There's just a lot of situations in which African-American people specifically, and also other people or persons of color, are marginalized. And that's kind of where we want to get started. But go ahead, Dr. Latifah.
I'm Latifah Jackson, and I have kind of worked in a couple of different areas. One, looking at public health approaches to infectious disease, and that really sparked my interest in thinking about genomic influencers on disease. And then I'm really interested in these questions about how equitable data analysis happens and how you include underrepresented populations in the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data. And so I've written a bit of work about that. And then also really interested in how the downstream analytical tools that we use in order to understand genomic data actually are equitable, and how they center not just populations that already have power, but populations that need to be at the table because their health is also on the line. So thank you for having me.
And I thank you for being here. And Akua?
Hey everyone, so I'm Akua, and thank you, Jen, for inviting me to the conversation, because I'm Gullah Geechee, and we're one of those communities who have not been invited to these conversations, but we're involved with a lot of like health research. So I appreciate y'all for inviting us to the tables to share our experiences and see how we can move forward with health equity.
Akua, before we go forward, for the people who are visiting and don't know what Gullah
I'm sorry.
and Gullah Geechee is, like I know you Gullah Geechee, but can you explain? Even though you have a Ghanaian name, I think isn't Akua Ghanaian? I think
yes,
so.
yes, it is. It is, but I named myself that. That's
okay.
not my government name.
Oh, okay. I love it. I'm here for all that. Like I'm here for all the authenticity. But can you tell our audience a little bit about the Gullahs and particularly why they have been of interest to a lot of medical research and specifically genetics?
Yes. Okay. So Gullah Geechee, we're descendants of West and Central Africans who were basically like human trafficked over here to southern plantations, and that's why we're like I guess you would say the target for like a lot of health research because we have the highest retention of African culture. Usually when people visit, oh, I see you trying to talk my hip feedback. Usually when people visit Charleston, they think they're either in a Caribbean island somewhere or they think they're in a part of Africa, like a little Africa, because of how close we have to hold on to our African ways of life. Like a lot of us, we still live off the land, the way that we our spiritual practices and even some of our health traditions. That's we rely on traditional medicine. Some just because of that oral tradition, and also because like in the 70s and 80s, it was still real racially segregated in Charleston. So a lot of us couldn't even go to these hospitals. So we had to use what our ancestors did so we can have some type of longevity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a beautiful story, and one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by it because it's a great example, a modern day example of how a population will persist with culture and also identity. This idea of identity with genetics in the presence of things like white supremacy. So, thank you so much for sharing and sharing that story and that information with the audience. I'm gonna unmute you, Eric, so you can introduce yourself.
All right, so thank you. As I think as Mallory said, my name is Eric Chery at the Indiana University School of Social Work. I'm here. Yeah, so I think on this conversation, you know, I do work in the slave dungeons in Ghana and compare them to life the way they happen here. And you know, it's from that area you get to see, right, kidnapping people and walking them from 300 miles journey and keeping them at a place that they had to do almost nearly everything that they did there. And those places were ground that breed, I mean, so many kinds of sicknesses, disease. And I think like even issues with the sickle cell, I mean, trade, given the conditions under which those, I mean, sickle cell trade can carried over, especially when you have mosquito infected areas and all those kinds of things. You can see it's possible that they carry those genes across the Middle Passage, you know, and come in here. So my focus is on, I think, looking at how this history has passed across, and then the way Black people have been used in scientific experiment in not actually for their own benefit, but used to satisfy the interests of racist America. And I think those interconnected interests of racist capitalism, racist medical interests, and also the racist political structure that continue to revive itself. And so if they continue to revive themselves, then the question becomes, you know, what happens if, even in the context of new innovations and all that are happening, the system, has there been so much changes to the system and the structure, the way it was created? That I think is an important context to understand what are new technology, new innovations are going to benefit the Black population or not.
You. Uh-oh. Are you muted? This is all of the exciting part of being on like a live panel. We're live, folks. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that experience. And Jen, you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that experience while we're waiting for Janina's audio to come back? Wait, I can't hear you, Jenny. There.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that we want to focus on in this panel is community engagement and how to properly communicate with diverse populations. Janina, are you back?
I'm trying.
Yep, she's here. Okay.
Okay, yeah, you can hear me. I'm sorry. I just wanted to, and I don't know where you guys were in the conversation, but Eric, thank you so much from starting with the transatlantic slave trade. And I think, you know, you bring up this very important thing when you brought up sickle cell. When we think about genetics, our genes, you know, when people think about things changing from one generation to the next generation, these changes that are happening are really happening for our survival, right? And so when we talk about malaria, our ancestors lived in a place where there were large amounts of mosquitoes that caused malaria. Our bodies developed these mutations to protect us from malaria. And then when we go through something traumatic like the transatlantic slave trade, and we are moved from our natural environment into a new environment, there hasn't been enough time for our bodies to evolve from generation to generation, even now, right? So the question, you know, there's a couple of things here. One, I think when we're talking about sickle cell, we don't always tell the beautiful story of how having mutations are part of a beautiful story about our past and a beautiful story about human. So that's one, how we contextualize some of these mutations and things that have happened into negative things, but also, you know, now we have that is being able, that is now available to better understand these things and take into account, because in general, as a human race, we're all more transient. I mean, if COVID-19 taught us anything, it taught us that we can move things across waters very easily. So Eric, I kind of wanted you to talk a little bit about, you know, starting with the transatlantic slave trade, and all of us who, you know, our ancestors who came over through that process, they also had a lot of sicknesses and diseases and things like that have happened through slavery and post-slavery. And there has been a gap in medical treatment and access. Can you talk a little bit about how that was kind of like a formalized thing to not have access to medical treatments and this technology, and to how that has started there but now persists today?
Sure. I mean, I think you know, one of the most important piece about the transportation, the kidnapping of the ancestors in here, the economic interest was so big, and I think at the time, you know, even today, capitalists, in as much as they want to accumulate the money, they don't want to spend the money on you. And so at the time, so you see medical institutions and health practices at the time were all about satisfying these folks for work to accumulate money. And at the same time, what really, you know, initiated this whole process was the racist idea about their inferiority being inherent. And so even when there was the need, when they recognized that, okay, they were even sick or something was wrong with them, it was not considered that as a public health issue that need to be treated. You know, they were considered, because of their inferiority, they needed to be even more treated further to make them sound for work. And then the piece that I think make this whole, that gap was that most of the medical, health professionals at the time, as some of the work in Harriet Washington described, they were much more, they will pay more higher when they certified the slave to be fit for work rather than treating that person that they were sick. And because it was all because there were a lot of insurance companies and people would be sued if you got a slave that was not, fit, because then you're not going to get money. And so both insurance companies, the health professionals, and a lot of medical trainers were trained to manage slaves. And to the degree that even when they have to get in to help them when they were so much sick and get involved, it wasn't even about the interest of the slave. It was about the interest of the slave masters. And that was the economy. And then for the medical, practitioner who will be involved at the time, white physicians, it was actually for them to learn more about those kinds of diseases and things and use them as an experiment in terms of how they can use this knowledge to treat a white population. So you see this paradox where on one hand, you are considering these folk that they are inferior, but you're using knowledge from them to inform medical practices to treat those that you said that they were, different from them. So right there, you saw that paradox, but nobody disputed that. And it was because it was tied into the economic and it was tied into power. And then the other area too was about, because they realized right from even the African shows, when they realized the strength and some of the resiliency and everything about these Africans, one of the ways that they did was to really subjugate them through violence means. And so by withholding even treatment from them was a way to ensure that they are not that healthy to stand to rebel against them, but to be able to control them in a way that will advance the interests of the racist America that was being built up.
You know, that's a really interesting point, and there are kind of two things that I want to talk about from there. One, if you talk about these two things, that our healthcare was tied to capitalism, getting us fit enough to go back to work, and was tied to the scientific curiosity of the use of Black bodies as research subjects, right? Unconsented research subjects. And I think this ties a lot into your work, Latifah, but I want to bring it to your work, Latifah. So two things. One, experience in your own communities and with your families. But I very much so come from a family where we go to the doctor when things have gotten to that point where we cannot work, where we cannot function. And psychologically, I'm thinking, well, if this is started back from slavery, psychologically, this is carried over into generations, and this is how we have always, as present-day modern African Americans, engaged with the medical system, that we have only known to go to the doctor when we cannot go to work and we cannot function. And so breaking out of that generational train of thought still carries on till present day. Whereas a white person is taught that I go to the doctor every year for preventative and prophylactic treatment. We have not, that is not literally embedded into our psyche and our communities. And then the other is, Latifah, going back into this psychology and how this started, right? If we also have been subjugated to medical research unconsented and not by choice due to the remnants of slavery, now in present day, when we actually have an option and a choice, how does that affect our will and want to engage in medical research?
Look, I think these are really good questions. And I think it's very clear that for people who have been in economically marginalized, tortured states, and are sitting underneath a power structure, it is in their community's best interest to never forget the things that they've experienced, mostly because there are patterns to these experiences. And the patterns that we saw right after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, are patterns that we see today, right? And that those inform people from communities that have been underserved or have been purposefully marginalized. Watch out, here comes something that you might want to get to prepare for. And of course, African Americans are diverse both in their genomics, but then also diverse in their cultural perspectives to interactions with structures of power, right? So we find ourselves in very different positions than many other ethnic groups that have had long-term residency in this country. That is to say, we are interested in understanding how precision medicine can help us. But we're also not interested in being the lowest level, try it first on them and see how it works out, individuals in any structural system. With that said, I think there is a clear desire for all of us to kind of reap the benefits, because this is the thing. And so we know as African Americans that the money that is largely being put in at the basic science level to address and develop precision medicine is coming from all Americans, which means it's coming from us, right? And so how do we as African Americans who pay taxes as well, who have not been for most of our history, even though we've been paying taxes, not been the beneficiary of federal programs that, reallocate those funds out to communities, whether those are research communities, et cetera. So at Howard, we find that if you have a good relationship with the community that you're interacting with, that it's not hard to get people excited about precision medicine, thinking about precision medicine, bringing their own expertise to the table, but that's a dialogue, right? As all research should be, a dialogue between the person who has some scientific knowledge and the community people who have cultural, social, etc. kind of knowledge. And we can bring these two, behavioral knowledge, we can bring these two things together, marry them, and really gain insights into, what's happening. And I will say that, with that said, I was in a group giving a guest lecture yesterday at Colorado School of Public Health. And one of the things that somebody asked me was, are there guidelines for how do you do inclusive research? And it really kind of made me think, because I told the student that was a paper that they needed to write, obviously, because there aren't guidelines. There are, if you do this, we'll slap your hand guidelines, but there are no best practices in really getting the entirety of American science, of what we call Western science, this sort of European, American, Australian science, to really grapple with the structures of racism and white supremacy that they put in place, and what that actually then means for those populations that are now in ascendant numbers.
Yeah, I think that I really agree with you, that I kind of think that this should be a collaboration, that a community or a community collaborator in this research collective should be as equal a partner as any scientist in this. This is an equally collaborative thing. And one thing that I think has been largely missing from research is the benefit, like we just talked about and Eric mentioned, we have a deep psychology and that has been carried on for years, that medicine and medical treatment is not done for our benefit, it is done for our survival, which benefits capitalism or benefits the health of white people. And so I really do believe that, like you said, it should be this collaboration with both cultural and scientific. So speaking of the cultural, and we're talking about, how most Black Americans has this embedded psychology that goes back into slavery. The Gullah Geechee is a very different story, right? Where we are so blessed really to be able to still have a part of our native culture in present day. And you see some of these examples in countries like, we have the Garifuna in Honduras. You also have the people of Palenque in Colombia, and we have the Gullah Geechee in the US. And so Akua, I just want to hear you speak a little bit about how, when we talk about engaging with medical practices, what are the experiences of a community that has been able to preserve their culture and their heritage and be somewhat of a rebellion to these societal systems, and how they might engage in this collaboration that that Dr. Jackson was just talking about.
Can y'all hear me? Okay, yeah. So some of the things that I remember, like growing up, I was speaking to my grandma, like I was saying earlier, we still rely on like traditional medicine. Like yesterday, my grandma was telling me when she was a little kid, if she was to cut her knee or anything, they would use a spider web to heal it up. You know, that she wouldn't go to the doctor, they would use a spider web. And how that looks in today, though, you have a lot of people who want to go to the hospital because there's certain things, you know, that traditional medicine probably can't treat. So we look at it as like, how can we balance out the two? But some of our experiences haven't been so good. I think Eric, you mentioned Harriet Washington's book, and I'm reading that book now, and MUSC is actually mentioned in that book, and that's one of the hospitals in my city. And there's even like I don't know if that's in every area, but I know even where I'm at, we have certain hospitals where we nickname the killer hospital, because it's like, you know, if you go there, your chances of dying is high. And it's not like that for other races. And most of us, this kind of just a thing that we know of. So how we deal with it is we seek out traditional medicine, or we seek out somebody within the community. What some people call them root doctors, which I don't like saying, because I feel like that leaves that like a negative stigma around it, but it's not anything negative. It's just really you using herbs and stuff from the earth to heal yourself, because you can't go to either the hospital or you can't find a doctor who knows going to treat you like an actual human being. But you do have some programs that are trying to bridge that gap. And I feel like one of the biggest pieces that's missing is like I'm an educator, so one of the things I feel like they're kind of overlapping. What they're trying to do is implement more culturally responsive education within like all these systems. But I feel like what's missing is that nobody wants to name the issue. Like, instead of like, yes, culturally responsible, call it what it is. It's anti-Blackness. Because you can also have Black people who are in the medical field who participate in anti-Blackness like ideologies, who are still like being harmful. So I feel like what it looks like to change those experiences is to meet people where they are. And just using like Jennifer, for example, when she came down here, you know, she like immersed herself into our culture. And that's huge for us because we're like a real tight-knit community. One thing that we say down here, we call it a binya and a kamya. So a binya just means like you've been here. Like, we know, like, you born and raised within Gullahs culture, you from here, we know who you are. A kamya is like you came here. So you wasn't originally from here. And so that's just how we identify if the person is from here or not, and how we know, okay, like, who are you? Are you a good spirit or not? That's just kind of how we operate, because just of that generational trauma, I feel like, of hospitals just saying that they're coming in to help, but then doing the complete opposite.
Yeah, I mean, so I do want to bring Jennifer into the conversation with this next question. And really, and you mentioned anti-Blackness. And I think, first of all, I always say this, but we all deal with anti-Blackness. I think a lot of white people don't realize that Black people deal with anti-Blackness. And to what Eric was talking about earlier, is because we have no choice. Anti-Blackness is a part of our survival. And so, Jennifer, as a student, and well, first of all, before I even get there, I just want to say everyone looks so amazing. I didn't say this in the beginning. Everyone looks so amazing, and everyone looks so well moisturized, and everyone is so well spoken. So we are glistening and shining today. Yes, like I have to mention all of this beautiful melanin that is blessing CRISPR-Con right now. But Jennifer, I want to, because we have the perspectives of the community, we have the perspective of the researcher, we have the perspective of a historian and cultural expert. I want to hear the perspective of the next generation, because you're going to be the next generation of scientists. And in my generation, when I'm not a whole generation under you, but when when I was in graduate school, I dealt a lot with my anti-Blackness, and it actually did affect the way that I presented myself in the science community. And to an extent, the way I presented myself in my own community was this double life. And you've heard me talk about this idea. I call myself a Janetta cis, right? This complex psychosocial divide of I got to be a scientist one day, and then I got to be a Black woman another day. And it's just complicated, and how you deal with that. So Jennifer, how are you dealing with your anti-Blackness as you come in to be the next generation of scientists that are going to be, really informing this technology and being a seat at the table for us?
I'm going to start off by saying Instagram posts is like the main way that my anti-Blackness comes out, because I'm like, okay, tone, and then I want to say y'all, because that's me. I'm from the South. But then I'm like, oh, we need to talk about epigenetics. How do I like get this across to the people? And so kind of the place that I would say I started with this whole project and just getting to the root of it all was, you can't see my video? Okay. Kind of the place that I started with this was understanding the myths about culture, right? So to Eric's point and Latifah's point, myths are where we kind of started with everything in the transatlantic slave trade and slavery and dealing with Blacks. And the myths were on both sides, right? So we had Blacks believing that doctors were somewhat bad or that they were out to hurt them. And then we had white professionals believing that, oh, Blacks can endure a lot of pain, or that Blacks don't need to go to the doctor. They can be out and about and just work without any, rest or relaxation or recovery. And so that was like the first thing, like addressing the myths and thinking that there's some truth to it, right? So I would look up YouTube videos. I would look up very unconventional, non-scientific literature and information to understand who the Gullah were and what they believed, because their beliefs outweigh anything that I could have told them about themselves, right? Their beliefs are their culture. Their beliefs lead into their lifestyle practices. Their beliefs will govern whether or not they receive me, whether or not they receive research. So I thought that their beliefs were really important. So I started off with myths. And that was a way that I feel also that I addressed anti-Blackness, because some of our myths are rooted in trauma, but they do kind of have a little bit of truth to them, so there's nothing wrong with entertaining a myth. And then once I got into the culture, I think Akua and I were talking about this the other day. She was like, she ate our food. Listen, food is important. So anytime you want to talk about Black people, you know that A, you got to try the food. B, you have to be transparent. And C, your reputation will meet you at every doorstep before you get there. So I think that this project allowed me to embrace my own Blackness even more and just really be proud of where I came from. Because in graduate school alone, whether or not you're at a HBCU or PWI, I'm sure there are some levels of imposter syndrome, anti-Blackness, learning how to write, properly for literature and publications. That's stressful. And you don't feel like yourself because you're not speaking in the tone that you normally would. So I think that this project allowed me to have both sides and figure out how in the long run am I going to be able to talk to Black people about healthcare and really health education, because at the crux of it is not going to be about genetics. It's not going to be about ancestry. It's going to be, how can we make you know that prevention is the only way that you're going to survive these chronic diseases that plague our communities. Because it's not always about genetic inheritance patterns. I feel like our environment, the structural racism that we've grown up in and been passed down for generations really precedes any type of treatment that we could have right now.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree. And first of all, thank you for doing all this important work at so early on in your career. Latifah, I don't know who is writing that guideline, but Jennifer also needs to be a co-author on that.
Absolutely.
So
I don't know if Jennifer mentioned, but most of the students in the lab that Jennifer is in are writing bioethics papers, because these are critically lacking in the field. If you're working with a community that is a non-majority culture community, then there are ethical issues that you have to, as a scientist, work through for yourself, but then also, in collaboration and coordination with that community. But then you also need to report that information out so other people can have a better understanding of where the guardrails are. How do you protect the community that has its own identity, and how do you do something so that they have skin in the game and you have skin in the game, and that your skin in the game is not being a colonialist extractor of resources from that community, but that there's some sort of shared responsibility. So I always tell them, like, even for me, if I'm working on a project and we don't have an upfront conversation about who has the power to be first author or who doesn't, who has the power for whatever those things are that matter in that interaction, the rewards of it, we have to have an upfront conversation about that. Who owns the data? Who's, these kinds of things help to build trust, and of course, breaking bread. I can't forget Rihanna saying at one point, if you have people and you like them and they break bread with you, then tell them to pull up, right? And
yes,
I think that's the whole message. And I always think, like, if you treat people the way that you would want to be treated, and you offer that, you tell them, this is what I value, and these are the rewards that I can see getting. What are the rewards that you can see getting? How can we make sure that those things happen? But then at the end of the day, our responsibility is also to train people from any community that we're working with so they can represent themselves.
Absolutely.
Nobody tells the story of our family like our family does. Nobody loves you like you love yourself.
And that's shameless plug. The paper's coming. It's in edits right now, so it's coming.
Oh, okay. So you're already on the paper. Okay, I didn't realize that this.
They said I have to get it out. This is for my dissertation.
Yes, you have to get it out. Yes. So I think, I think these are all great things. Like, we have really already acknowledged the problem, and we know that this problem is not something that's new. It's not something that was created when the sequence of the human genome happened. This is something that is really the entirety of the history of medicine in this country, that there is this systemic inequity. And when we talk about technology and we talk about what Eric spoke on, is that, like, the way we engage with the medical community being for our survival, for capitalism, or for the benefits of white people through research, and kind of trying to change this narrative with the things that you talked about and the work that you're doing, Jennifer. Henrietta Lacks is a great example of this, right? Where, without going, I wanted to play a clip from the podcast, but the way this audio is, I just don't even want to risk it. Just to tell you guys really quickly, the story of Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman in her 30s who was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and cells from her cervix were extracted from her and used for medical research without her consent. And I talked about this idea that I'm a geneticist and that I have this, like, psychosocial divide and this double consciousness, this complex psychology, right? Where I'm a scientist and a Black woman. And I knew of this HeLa cells, which are the cells that are actually the descendants of her cervical cells, being used in science labs when I was in graduate school. And sadly enough, in my 20s in graduate schools, I had never heard of Henrietta Lacks, and then learned about Henrietta. And it was just crazy to me that this woman died in her 30s. She died, and her cells are saving lives. We wouldn't know how many chromosomes we had if it wasn't for Henrietta Lacks. We wouldn't have vaccines for HPV if it wasn't for Henrietta Lacks. We would not have a large amount of molecular research would not be possible. Cell research would not be possible without Henrietta Lacks. And this is a lot of cancer, right? And so I always see these documentaries and they show these kids dying of cancer, and they're really, really sad. And I always feel that there's a disconnect, because every time I see these documentaries and we talk about these genetic studies, they're always focusing on young white children, and there's not enough representation of other children, which as a viewer could be internalized as, oh, young Black children or children of color that's not an issue that's large enough. But anyway, the point I'm trying to say is that is an example of where we use Black participants or participants of color to advance medicine for larger communities, but the intention of the invention was not with people of color. The intention of the invention were with white people. And so, Eric, I kind of want to bring it back to you a little bit to understand from your research, how this impacts us. But most importantly, the very foundation of science, the words that we use. Jennifer, you talked about having to write papers in a language that is not your native language. All of this is white supremacy, and it affects all of us. So how do we, how can we be, I guess, like, how can this idea that technology is going to help us, to Latifah, your point, how can we even start there? And maybe, Eric, you can speak on some of the history and things that I'm missing, because we hadn't talked to you since we were back in the transatlantic slave trade. So feel free to talk, more broadly if you want.
You're on mute.
Yeah. So even how do we even begin to deal with the mistrust that have been sold in the communities? And I think this mistrust is not something that is just history. I mean, I think just last year I had a friend who told me, and I was so, I mean, it wasn't a surprising thing to me, but at the same time, it was kind of like, this is the hypocrisy that we live in here. This was in 2019. This friend took his wife to the hospital who was about to deliver, and they got to the hospital, and then the doctor said, oh, no, she's not due yet, and all this, so you should take her back home. And she couldn't understand. She said, my wife has been crying this. Okay, so they did everything. They said no. And then on the way, so eventually she had to take her, he had to take her back home. And this was around 12 a.m. And on the way, once they got to the apartment, they were about to get out of the car, she started crying again. And he didn't know what to do. So then he had to get into the car, taking her back to the hospital. Then they got there, and eventually she delivered around 2:30 a.m. Okay, like this was the same person that a while ago they said everything was okay and that he should take her back home. That was 2019. Even this year, I've had other instances, other friends who have said those kinds of things to me. And so you hear some of these things, they continue to foster the same mistrust because the pattern is still there. And then to the idea what Jennifer was talking about, we know, that this whole issue is interconnected with, the environment, an important piece. And oftentimes people talk about, okay, the food you eat. And there have been some of this myth where even about that, Black people eat dirt. And that was what brings some of their sicknesses and other kinds of stuff. But people forget that the conditions and the spaces, the environment where Black people are segregated into areas that have food desert. And even if they can have opportunity to buy food, they don't have the resources. So this is not just like one aspect that even if we do the technology that brings it, are they going to be giving it to them for free? What is the condition for accessibility? And these are patterns that have over generations shown. We see how the American Medical Association has been so relentless when anytime cases for progressive healthcare came up, right, between the 1800 up until 1930s. And even today, some of the practices still so-called in the de facto racial era is still a pretense. But underneath it, the structures that facilitate all of these processes, we haven't done so much about them. We talk about, because if the very foundation, people were not included, their interests and everything were not part of the issue. And today, it's just like we go in here, we talk to people, but they are not institutionalized. So tomorrow they can be disregarded. So this whole issue, it's not something that if we're thinking, it's not something that is going to really last without that, dialogue, but we have to move from the dialogue and deal with the structures and the systems, the environmental injustices and the poverty that they come with, some of the areas, there are research that show these days in 2020, plumbing poverty, where areas where African Americans live, Native Americans and Latinos live, there is plumbing poverty, which is lack of access to quality water that is essential for maintaining health and for keeping sanity, keeping hygienic environment. So if all of these issues are not addressed, and then we invent technology, technology will not actually address a lot of these environmental issues. The poverty, the lack of, educational opportunities for people, and even the food desert that are in a lot of the communities. And this is also one piece. Like when you look at the slave dungeons, when they were keeping them, one of the ways that they were helping them to deal with their condition, they were giving them tobacco. We know the health risk associated with just tobacco. They were giving them so that they will be able to live past their depression and the sadness that they had because of the conditions that they had conditioned them into. So the question I think we want to talk about today, I want to ask is, if we're thinking about the technology and everything, do we still have segregation here? Residential segregation, even access to wealth creation and wealth maintenance, do we have them? Then if we have all of those things, and then even just the name itself, race, the label that we have, it's not just a label, it's meaning encoded. So to the degree that we say this is white, this is black, because anytime you say white, you are laying claim to an entitlement. When whiteness was conferred, it was something that it wasn't just by laws, socialization in a very relentless way, that if you don't live as a white person the way we expect you to live, we're going to revoke it. That was the power of the law and the socialization. So we look at the effort that were invested in to bring us to where we are. Then the question is, if we're thinking about doing any other issues, bringing changes and innovations, the effort to make those innovations benefit everybody, I compare them to what led us to where we are now. Are they of the same magnitude?
Mm-hmm. And I think you bring up a very good point, which is I personally believe that a lot of us don't want to be honest with ourselves with who this research should be benefiting. And I strongly believe one of the biggest gaps, and it's a gap because I don't think the intention is actually there, is that we can't just skip over and say that this technology is for everyone. That actually is not enough, because the history of our lives is that everyone doesn't mean us. Everyone means not us. And so, to try to talk about creating this technology and improving it, like, can each of us maybe give a specific recommendation or example of how people who are researchers, particularly gene editing researchers who are here with us, can start to engage with these communities well? I'll go ahead and start, and then I'll pass it on. Is that okay? Okay, I'll go to you next, Latifah. So one of the things one recommendation that I would give is that we really sit and evaluate what consent and engagement looks like. Eric talked a lot about, we talk about these systemic structures that are in place. One, having access to healthcare. The other being the racial wealth gap, right? So a researcher just consenting participants and saying, is it okay that I use your data, is actually not enough. There is not enough literacy to talk about what is the value of my data. I mean, you are begging me for it and you want me to sign this paper and give you permission, but is that enough? It's not enough. It's not enough for me to say, yes, you can use my data. I actually need engagement with you to tell me what is the value of my data and why should I just say yes for free? Is consent taking into account the financial inequity and racial gap that exists globally? Meaning that it's not so much that I consent, that actually I should be compensated for the use of my data, whether that compensation looks like including me or training up my community or providing resources to my community or doing all of that in addition to also providing a financial contribution to myself. And I think when we start to bring that up in the conversation, we really start to see that the intent behind this research is not for equity, because that would lead to equity. And I think a lot of people are afraid of that because deep down, really, really deep down, a lot of us don't want, and I don't want to say us because that's not true for everyone, but a lot of people are afraid to admit that I don't just need this research to answer my research question and benefit my population, but I don't really have a true intention of making things equitable holistically. And I'm not accusing, I'm just saying, when we start to say, hey, why don't we give money? Why don't we give these things? We hear a lot of no's, okay? And those are the things that make just basic health more equitable. So Latifah, that's my recommendation. Evaluate what consent means. Latifah, you go ahead.
I had kind of two recommendations. The first one is sort of the downstream impact is that we have to start to decolonialize our science. We can no longer think that it's scientists to go into communities, extract resources, never see those people again, and then treat those samples that we've collected as if they're human playing cards. Like you can swap them to another lab for fame and glory and grants and whatever the kudos of our industries are. So that would be the first one. And so in line with that, I would say, number one, I am not really interested in seeing studies, whether they're from Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, if it's not clear that there was any indigenous person who contributed to the work. And I don't mean that they procured the samples, because there's always been somebody who's willing to procure the samples, hand them over, and then let that be that. I mean, how do they make an intellectual contribution? We've written a paper that is in Frontiers in Big Data that talks about how do you get vulnerable populations or underrepresented or historically marginalized populations to participate in data science. And the underarching kind of theme of that is you have to make a space where there's parity and there's an opportunity for them to equally have a voice in how things move forward. So that would be one of them. And then the other part is we have to also look at the way that we have grown, particularly genomic science. And genomic science has largely grown as a result of advances in technology, as opposed to advances in just understanding, right? So you can get a grant probably tomorrow if you do 500 million people and use a super new technology without ever asking, is this a new population? Is this does this fill a gap? And so that is why when we look at things like genome-wide association studies, only 4% of them represent non-European or Han Chinese populations, right? And so no population on this planet is stupid. When they see that they're not represented, they're like, why is that? And they can reason out why they're not included, right? And so I would just say that those are two things that I think people can do. Increase algorithmic bias, or decrease algorithmic bias by including more people from those communities, and then make decolonized science. I will say that there are positive steps in these directions, and there is a whole community of people that are called Fairness and Accountability in Machine Learning, FATML, or Accountability and Transparency in Machine Learning. And they are thinking about this, about algorithmic fairness. But it has to be something that we think about at the most basal level, and it almost is kind of the thing that needs to go in, Jennifer's bioethics paper, which is, if we're not thinking about fairness and that's not baked into the pie at the very beginning, whatever data we get out at the end is going to be crazy. And so I'll just leave with one final thought, which is all of us as scientists and as humans someday are going to be in a situation where we stand in front of the communities that we're studying, working with, And if you feel uncomfortable by that thought of answering for the study that you've done on any particular population, then maybe you should change the way that you're doing your work so that you can stand in front of, so Jennifer can stand in front of Akua and, and all of the members of the Gullah Geechee population and say, I did this work. I hope that you like it, and where there are disagreements, they're methodological ones and not you're not respecting my spirit kind of, disagreements. And so if we can do that, we'll be moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Akua, we haven't heard from you in a while. What kind of recommendations would you give to researchers who are trying to engage well, and I would say meaningfully?
Okay, so I have an example. So a couple months ago, MUSC, they sent out like a survey because they wanted to like better engage the community. And they wrote the survey in their attempt at Gullah Geechee, but they didn't like enlist an actual Gullah Geechee person. So going back to like Latifah said, there was no like Gullah Geechee intellectual influence on that. And so it came off as if they were trying to mock the way that we speak, like naturally. So I would say a better way is to like include us at the table before you're making these decisions, so we can tell you like how it should be done, instead of you just assuming, okay, I read a book about this culture, I feel like I got it. It'll be better to actually engage in the community, and then we can say, okay, hey, this is what it looks like. And I know for me, I feel like it'll be better to have somebody that reflects our community, because a lot of times we have even like Gullah Geechee people, they'll go to MUSC, but as soon as they finish their work, they'll ship them off somewhere else. So we don't even have like people who are from the community. So now it's like you have to build a level of trust. It's like trust building. And I feel like the first step of that is to actually like engage and sit down with that community, and not just you engaging because you want something, even though of course you need something, but actually engaging because you want to learn this culture, outside of the like academic research or outside of your professional setting. You want to understand and learn about this culture.
So kind of being genuine and also being culturally inclusive.
Right.
Eric, what about you? What kind of recommendation would you give researchers to engage well?
Number one, I think they need to give power to the people. I mean,
power.
Because researchers come into community in the name of experts, and doing what they do, but that's where they bring in all of these lenses, and those that are even couched under participatory or all kinds of name, the names and the everything don't equate to the action itself. And by giving power, that means that I think they need to really learn from people and take their perspective, not just like go in and direct people because grant dictates that this is the requirement, this is what you need to get. Because oftentimes they are all about getting a product to meet the grant requirement. And so I think giving power to the people in that way, grant makers and granting agencies also, we need to let them understand that it is not them who should decide the outcome of the research. It has to be that kind of, collaborative with the people, with the community, to be able to have and come out with a product that they want to get and the impact that it's going to make on everyone. Then the next, the last piece of that I think related to, the power is, even with the academia and everything, we need to renounce whiteness. It's an important thing. And that doesn't, when I say we need to renounce whiteness, because everything that comes with so much of those, the privilege, where people, even in higher education, has become like a privilege. People are inducted into this cycle. And here is a case, after all of it, then you want to go back to the less privileged to help them to do anything, but you're going in a privileged position. So how do you leverage that? I think use that education to bridge the gap And if that is going to happen, then whiteness has to be renounced, even in the training of researchers and training of future academicians and future scientists. And that is going to be happen if we include the structure and how the structure has been evolving from history. Because it's not just something that just happened. It has a basis. Like sometimes you're right, even in the academia or the papers publication, they want you to see what is the basis, what are you basing your argument on? And the kind of the database that we base our argument on these days, all of them, majority of them are whiteness. So sometimes we have to understand somebody writes something that doesn't have the whiteness lenses, the way they are being talked about, people reject them. But if we continue to keep it that way, it will still keep the same status quo.
Yeah, I mean, we are running close on time, but I think I do want to hear from you, Jennifer, and I have kind of a closing question more so related to the below and some of the fears and things. I agree. Everything that everyone has said so far really reminds me that none of these things I've seen happen in a very meaningful way, which really re-emphasizes and exposes us to the very underlying issue. These are things we've all said before. These are things have yet to be implemented in meaningful ways. And so don't just hear these things, do these things, and really come to terms with the fear you have in doing them. Okay, Jennifer, if you don't mind just doing it really quickly.
I'm gonna give it real quick. So one statement is sampling bias creates false results, so scientists aren't able to move forward. And being Black is not a monolith. I mean, just right here on this panel alone, we have representation of first generation African, you know, Gullah Geechee. Dr. Latifah is representing PG County, and Janina, you are my Creole queen, you know, and I'm from Arkansas. So we're not monolithic at all. And you can't go into our communities thinking that you can, for example, tell me a paper about Arizona African Americans and think that responds to all of us, because it doesn't. And even in our own cities and communities, we have different faith patterns, different belief structures, different foods that we eat. If we're talking about Chicago and their segregation, everyone may be from Mississippi and Alabama, but they're different too, you know, in comparison to us. So I really dislike when people say that all African Americans are the same, because we're not. Texans, they different too. They're a little bit of Creole, a little bit of country. It's just that, I think that bothers me the most. And when it translates into science, it's problematic because it's not taking us into account as actual human beings with human experiences that are vibrant and variable and all inclusive. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, guys, I want to go a little bit to the future, if that's okay. Can you travel with me to the future? Okay, let's go to the future, right? Let's talk about what this responsible innovation looks like, and how it can lead to improved health outcomes. We talked about this social structure and this thing called race, and obviously we're here at CRISPR-Con, places where people are doing gene editing, and I'm sure there's been a lot of conversation about what is responsible and what is ethical. I don't know how many of you are watching Lovecraft Country on HBO, but they are playing a little bit with the future and some of these dystopian ideas. And so one question I had, I'm going to also talk about, so let me go back. So one question I have, and we talk about CRISPR and how CRISPR is being used, and we talk about how that might be for a Black person and improved health outcomes. But I don't think a lot of these researchers understand that if CRISPR was an available technology to all of us, some of the things that impact our daily lives that we might want to change may be the beautiful parts of our identity that social structures have taught us to not be. And one example is in that episode of Lovecraft Country, there's a character who transforms from a Black woman into a white woman. And in that experience has this lofty experience. And so we play around with what can this technology look like? And we're talking about improving health outcomes where Black people just want to improve daily outcomes and walking up the street. And so those things haven't been addressed in meaningful ways yet. And all of the things that we just recommended have not been really instituted yet. And so what does responsible innovation look like? I mean, obviously we need to do away with even people wanting to be a different race, right? Like that has to not be a thing before we can start talking about, okay, let's get rid of sickle cell disease. Because every day I wake up and I think about being a Black woman. I don't have the privilege not to. And so if given this opportunity, I have dealt with my anti-Blackness in a way that I love being Black and I would never change it. But this may not be the experience of other non-white people. So what does responsible innovation look like? I know that was a really dystopian idea, and I know probably none of us have these ideas, but we all have things that we want to change. And the reason why we want to change them are implicated by social structures and the oppression that we have undergone. What does responsible innovation look like to you? 2 minutes, sorry.
Put the money where the people need it the most. Period. Period. Put the money where the people need it. So if sickle cell is such a problem, give us more funding for that. You know, help us with the preventative care, because CRISPR is necessary, but we can do so much on the front end to where we don't have to really focus so much on gene editing. And I hate to say that being a geneticist, but that's true. If we, focus on preventative care for people. That's my recommendation.
So I'm going to say that I think, when people go in for plastic surgery, they have to kind of go through psychological counseling first. And to figure out whether the thing is the right thing for them, or it's because they have some internal process that they're working through. And I think kind of the science industry has to think about this, and I chalk a lot of it up, and I'll say this is the last thing, to this kind of disconnect between how engineers think and how scientists think, and then how medical doctors think. Sometimes you end up with this, if we can do it, we should do it. And that's not true. That's not always true. So let's be more thoughtful about what we can and should do in the face of innovation. And just because we have the technology doesn't mean we should go super Frankenstein, especially when we don't know what the downstream effects will be.
Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't actually, just to chime in here, we shouldn't also be eager to try new things out on a population that's vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And I think it is also important that we move away from being silo disciplined and think transdisciplinary, because everything that we do are connected to humans, connected to society. And in doing that, I think if we go back to history, definitely we need to acknowledge what has been there, and then that will help us. Because one of the things that the history is important is when you look at it, you will see so many opportunities, different alternatives that could have been taken but were overlooked, and took on this path here that we have. And so if we can be that responsible while acknowledging the person, connecting the history to see the other alternatives that were possible, so that we can begin to take them to reimagine the society. And for that to happen, that's where I think that transdisciplinary lens becomes important.
Absolutely.
So I think piggybacking off of Jen, I think preventative care and creating safe spaces so Black people can learn their health history, because most of the time we only hear that question when we're at the doctor office. But a lot of us, we don't even know that. And then even trying to find that out, there's not a lot of safe spaces, because up until the Civil War, a lot of us were just considered property. So it's hard for Black people to even research down their ancestry line to even, know, okay, does my family have a history of cancer? Does my family have a history of high blood pressure? So even creating safe spaces so we can have those conversations, so we can figure out, before it's too late, or before we're sitting in the doctor's office and we're already diagnosed with something.
Jennifer, you want to take
no,
us home?
I thought we were about to end sooner, but just
we are ending soon.
I just, sometimes this conversation makes me feel like CRISPR in a way, the intention, like you said, wasn't for us. Because a lot of the things that CRISPR can do, right, and maybe taking you from Duchenne muscular dystrophy to like a Becker's or something like that. It's not, I mean, I actually have a cousin with DMD, but there are so many of us that have like sickle cell, and yet it's so underfunded. So it just makes me again reemphasize the point of, is it really for us, you know, and what can be done for the things that are really affecting African-American communities? Not saying that it's not CRISPR, but are you all going to give us funding to do actually the phases of work that needs to be done in African-American communities to use something like CRISPR? I don't know. I think that's really where I'm at with it. We need some help and some funding.
I mean, that's amazing. And to answer your question and to bring us back to the very fundamentals of how deep this issue is, first of all, how many people in our communities know what CRISPR is? So there is already a barrier of access. We know what gene editing is. We don't know what CRISPR is. We don't know, not saying we don't know, but we haven't been largely exposed to it. It's not normalized like it is in other communities. We need to normalize it. The intention wasn't to normalize it. And so to your point, who is this for, right? And it obviously was not created for us, but we have an opportunity to change that narrative. And having this space is a part of changing that narrative. And so I just want to thank you guys all for participating and sharing your beautiful melanin on this lovely Thursday morning. And really want to thank the organizers, because the organizers created this space to start the conversation on how we change the narrative. It's a very important space that we needed to hold. And thank you for allowing us to take up this space and make us and allow us to take up this space to share this perspective with a different audience that really needs to hear this. So thank you, Mallory. Thank you, Jennifer, and all the other organizers for inviting us here. I don't know what happened. Okay.
Hi, I'm here.
I have
thank you.
Okay. All right. I was like, what's happening? Okay.
That was abrupt, Janina.
Everybody else.
In order for me to come back on, we transferred the speakers off.
Okay. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, you're good.
Thanks so much for all of this.
Thank you, Janina. And I will just make some closing remarks. But thank you so much, Janina, and thank you to all of our panelists for blessing us with your melanin, yes, but also your time and your expertise. I am really happy we got to bring this conversation to CRISPRCon. I want to also thank our partners for this session, Howard University and Michael Friend. We just added a video from Michael about the importance of community engagement on sickle cell disease to the expo. So you all can check that out in the 10 minutes between now and our 12:45 breakout discussions. Thank you also to our sponsors and our CRISPRCon advisors who are all listed at CRISPRCon.org. And thank you so much to the audience that tuned in to listen and contribute. We will have this session posted on our YouTube channel and website within about 24 hours, so you're welcome to share it. I'll walk us through now how the Ideas Marketplace works. Janina, you're welcome to stay on, or if you want to drop off the feed, you can still listen from the backstage. But so at 12:45, we will start the Ideas Marketplace. So that's just in about 10 minutes, 12:45 Eastern rather. We'll start the Ideas Marketplace, which offers you all as the audience the opportunity to engage in small group video discussion on participant-led topics. So you can join those sessions by clicking the sessions button on the left-hand navigation bar. And then you can choose to join one of the sessions by sharing your audio and video. And up to 20 people can join a discussion and connect with other participants there. So we have one session that focuses on whether CRISPR can correct the inequality that our systems have built. That was a question that just came up actually in the audience chat just a moment or two ago. And then the second audience-led discussion is about public engagement through hands-on learning. We encourage all participants to head to one of those small group discussions after taking a break. And if there are too many people in those 2 sessions that were organized by volunteers, we do have sort of an overflow session with just a Keystone organizer. It will be me, spoiler alert, to have a general reflection conversation on some of your takeaways from this week. But I drive you to those first 2 sessions first that were organized by some volunteers, including actually Janina's colleague at GenSpace in Brooklyn. So for the next couple of minutes, feel free to stretch or take a break. You can meet fellow attendees through the People tab or the Networking tab. And you can also poke around the expo a little bit and watch some of the videos that I mentioned. We have several flash talks that you could watch in the next few minutes. And of course, please also continue the dialogue on Twitter at CRISPRCon, #CRISPRCon2020. And we'd love to see you around at future sessions, in addition to seeing you in these breakout discussions here in a couple of minutes. So I will be dropping off of this feed in just a second, but thank you so much to everyone who participated. We'll remain in the event chat where we can answer any questions anyone has about the Ideas Marketplace sessions. And again, thank you so much for being with us today.